So how did both of you, it seems like you're both in agreement, and in fact I am also in agreement on that position, but we'll talk about how that would be implemented. I mean, that sounds scary to a lot of people. I mean, I've had many family members and friends who've had problems with drugs. You know, when people hear the term legalization of drugs, they're worried that more people will use drugs, that drug use will increase. They think at least the drug war is holding a lid on things. I think that's the reaction that people have. That's the impression that people have. So let's talk about the war on drugs and what it is really and what it has accomplished.
Well, I think personally you have to look at, we've had almost 100 years of drug prohibition. We've had almost 4 decades of the war on drugs. We spent a couple of $1 trillion alone on interdiction. Yet and still, there are more drugs at cheaper prices on our streets than ever before. And see, the public goes under the mantra, indoctrination without investigation. Just like you're talking about people saying they're scared to death about legalizing drugs, that more and more people would use drugs. Yet and still, they're not looking at the crime and violence that the drug war has produced. Now, legalization is an answer to our crime and violence problem, not our drug problem. Once we legalize drugs, then we have to get down and start working with people who use, people who abuse, and people who are addicted. But what we have to understand too is that when we look at cigarette smoking, since 1960, over half of the people that smoke cigarettes no longer smoke, and we didn't arrest a person. There are effective drug programs throughout the world with the exception of the United States, such as heroin maintenance, cocaine maintenance, and methamphetamine maintenance. And it's been proven that these drugs can be controlled. Drugs are not the problem. The drug policies are the problem.
Let's talk about some statistics. 1% of our population in the United States, we just passed this threshold. 1% of our population is now in prison. It far exceeds the incarceration rate of any other country in the world. 3% of our population are in the criminal justice system. They're either in jail, on parole, or on probation. We have 5% of the population of the world, and we have, I think it's 25% of the imprisoned population of the world.
That is correct. When you look at the overall statistics, you see there are almost 8 million people in our criminal justice system who are either on probation, parole, halfway houses, prison, or jail. When you look at the real statistics, you see almost 2/3 of them are young Black Latino males, with 70% of them being there for drug-related charges. Wow. 10% of the African American population is within the criminal justice system. So that's the breakdown. When you look at Connecticut, Connecticut has something like 17,000 prisons, and again, with the same statistics, Black and Latino males make up less than 6% of the population, but they account for almost 70% of the people in prison, with again, 70% of them being there for drug-related charges.
So I just read today the most recent statistics. It costs about $20,000 a year per inmate to have people in prison. So if we have about 2.3 million people in prison, so we're talking about $40 to $50 billion a year just to house the prison population. Other statistics I've read is that between $50 and $100 billion a year is spent in the United States on illegal drugs. And most of that money goes overseas to terrorists, the Taliban for heroin, Colombian terrorists for cocaine, and international criminals all around the world. So we're talking about a massive amount of money leaving the United States and going to enemies of the United States, while at the same time we're spending $50 billion a year to house people in prison, and we're spending another $50 billion a year on interdiction.
Alone.
Right. And you're telling me that drugs are more plentiful and cheaper than they've ever been before.
It's a proven fact. Now, your statistics about the $50 billion to $100 billion here in the United States, it's more like 250 to 300 billion here in the United States alone. Worldwide underground economy of illegal drugs is over $600 billion according to the UN. And when you start to look at the international terrorist organizations, they derive 40% of their revenue from the sale and distribution of illegal drugs. It's like we keep shooting ourselves in the foot over and over again and telling the people that we're winning the war on terror.
Right. That's how I came to where I am now. I look at these numbers. I'm an engineer. I believe in quantitative analysis, in looking at public policy issues, in trying to find solutions, and looking at models of what other people have done elsewhere when it comes to drug laws, when it comes to health care, when it comes to economic issues, those sorts of things. You look at what people have done elsewhere, and you look at what works and what doesn't. And I've come to the conclusion that the war on drugs is not working. It's failing.
You're absolutely correct. There is a tremendous slow learning curve within American society, especially within the black and brown communities.
So, Joseph, can you talk about kind of your local experiences when you were heading the task force and how you came to think that what we were doing was not working?
The fact that drugs were so prevalent, when we first started enforcing with the Tri-Town Task Force, we were able to go out and make as many as 44, 33, 15, 20 arrests, all in one investigation. That's because the drugs were so prevalent and the enforcement was so lax at that point in time that it was fairly wide open. And there was very little fear of enforcement or being caught back then. That hopefully has changed now. However, drugs are still very prevalent in the suburbs. Even though the urban centers are targeted as the source, primary source of usage, et cetera, of drugs, that's not in fact the case. Urban communities is where drugs are extremely prevalent. We know that the number of people that we have arrested for drug use in our communities are not what people consider to be the potheads, the crackheads, the skills of the streets. Some of these people are lawyers and doctors and excellent students.
Somebody's spending whatever the number is, if it's $100 billion or $300 billion a year in the United States, someone is spending that money.
That's correct.
And it's not the urban poor.
That's correct. That money has to come from the sources that have the money in order to spend it on the drugs.
That's right.
So we knew back then that if you can't keep drugs out of prisons, which are supposedly the most secure facilities in this country, other than perhaps Fort Knox, how are you going to keep drugs out of schools? How are you going to keep them out of any other facility in our community if we can't keep them out of prisons? We know that prison guards have to continuously upgrade their skills in detecting the methods of sending drugs into the prisons, including even having to peel two pieces of a stamp together because there's LSD in between the two pieces.
Right. So what about the link between having drugs be illegal and the violence that we see in the urban areas, especially very recently? I mean, the number of homicides in Hartford has already exceeded this year the number that we had last year. I mean, it goes up and down, but did you see? Can you talk about that a little bit, being a police officer?
There is absolutely no question that a majority of the violence that we see is connected to drugs. There is so much money, so much profit involved in drugs that it's not something that is just going to be equally distributed amongst peers because they like each other.